Okay. I'm great. So, lesson 9, events leading to the American Civil War. This is a pretty famous painting. It's called Tragic Prelude by John Stewart Curry. Does anybody know who this guy in the middle is? Holding a Bible and a gun? I know who that guy is? Nope. He's a famous martyr from just right before the Civil War starts. He's also a famous abolitionist. Anybody? Has anyone ever heard of the name John Brown before? Okay, that is John Brown. John Brown is a very interesting abolitionist. He is a very religious man who believes that the institution of slavery should be brought to an end by force. He is involved in the events of Bleeding Kansas, notably the Potawatomi Creek Massacre, which we're going to learn about toward the end of this lesson. But he's involved in a more famous event known as the Raid on Harper's Ferry. He becomes one of the early martyrs of the abolitionist movement, carrying us into the Civil War, willing to die for the cause. Okay? So we'll talk more about him as we move forward. We'll get to him as we wrap the lesson up. But before that, people like John Brown were inspired by the Second Great Awakening. This really took off in the 1830s. If this gives you any idea of how much it took off, at the end of the Revolution, there's a couple thousand preachers in America. By the dawn of the Civil War, does anybody want to give me about a rough estimate of how many preachers we have in America? Obviously, America grows rapidly in that period of time, but does anybody want to take a wild guess? Well, we're talking about 2,000. We wouldn't have dropped to 100. Start with 2,000. We went in about less than 100-year period. We went from a couple of thousand to 40,000. That's a massive growth. That's what the Second Great Awakening does. All right? It's very easy to remember. It really takes off in the 1830s, 100 years after the First Great Awakening. A tidal wave of spiritual fervor in America. It's led by what are called circuit riders. Remember, in the First Great Awakening, we called these folks itinerants. These are people that went out and preached deeper into the interior and established churches. Well, same thing happens here. You have circuit riders or traveling preachers, itinerants, going out, establishing new churches. But we also see the formation of new religious movements as well as reform movements. Okay? So, for example, deism. Now, you all remember we talked about the Enlightenment. Deism was born out of the Enlightenment. Bless you. Deism's kind of like there's a belief in God, but there's not necessarily a belief in the Trinity. Okay? So a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers, guys like Rousseau and Voltaire and even Ben Franklin, got tied in with the deist movement. Unitarianism, religious movement, had a lot of connection in New England and in the North. A lot of abolitionists are tied to this group. They believe in a Unitarian doctrine and theory as opposed to the Trinity. The division of the Methodists and the Baptists at this period of time, remember, those groups were born out of the First Great Awakening, or at least got momentum through the First Great Awakening. What issue do you think will end up dividing those groups into northern and southern, excuse me, sectors. Very good. Slavery. We see like a northern and a southern Baptist split. Same with the Methodists. We have Shakers, which they have a really interesting sort of background. They got a pretty large following. They're very much about perfection. They were expert furniture builders. They also permitted dancing in their faith. They received inner light. But there was one thing that hurt the Shakers' numbers. They pledged an oath of celibacy. So it's kind of hard to raise your numbers when you don't have any kids. So that will hurt the Shakers. The Oneida, arguably one of the most interesting groups. I guess you could call them our 1840s hippies. This preacher that was inspired at Yale believed that Christ had returned to earth and the rapture had occurred in 70 AD. So with that belief, those that followed him in his community, if they believe that Christ has already returned, what do they believe they're free of? Sin. So there's a lot of free love going on in this community. And it ultimately falls apart, and in order to save it, they end up turning it into a silverware manufacturing company. There's a pretty good chance if you looked around your grandparents' house or maybe even your own house, you might have Oneida silverware in your house because the community, this utopian free love community, just didn't work out, didn't make it. Suffrage, women's rights, which we've talked about. Any idea what religious group has a lot of roots in the suffrage movement that had provided women in their community with rights since the First Great Awakening? What's that? Maybe some later. Looking for Quakers here. Yeah, the Quakers. We also have abolitionists that come about. Remember, Quakers have been around as abolitionists for quite a while now. And then other groups. Temperance, reform to ban alcohol. You have to understand at this period of time, alcoholism is just absolutely running rampant in America. It was devastating because, like, for example, how old do you have to be to legally drink now? 21, right? Do you think there was a legal drinking age then? Absolutely not. So the problems of alcoholism started for a lot of people at a very young age. So, like, for example, Edgar Allan Poe's brother, he died of alcoholism at the age of 24. I mean, you're doing some, like, real damage at that young. But again, this was a big problem. And then push for public education, founding of new colleges. I'm going to introduce you later to sort of the founder of the public education movement in this era. His name is Horace Mann. We're also going to be talking about new colleges that were established. You guys have heard of places like Longwood, right? Established during this era here in Virginia. Virginia Military Institute, my alma mater, established in 1839. There's a lot of different colleges that are established for different reasons during this time. Now, without a doubt, one of the most significant religious movements, if not the most significant religious movement that occurred during the Second Great Awakening, is the Mormon movement, also often referred to as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. A little background here. The prophet of the Mormon Church, Joseph Smith, born in Vermont, but established the church and the religion and the Book of Mormon in Western New York. The group's persecuted. They moved to Pennsylvania. They're pushed out of Pennsylvania. They move to Ohio. They're pushed out of Ohio. They wind up in Missouri, where they're going to do battle with the local Missourians. They move from Missouri to Carthage, Illinois, where their leader, Joseph Smith, and his brother Hiram are killed by a mob. And eventually, the group will be led by its second prophet, Brigham Young, to the desert Zion in Salt Lake City, Utah. But the Mormons have some issues. It's not just their religious doctrine. The first Mormon church allowed for one that was unpopular in American society. Polygamy, right? So like Smith had over 40 wives. I think Brigham Young had over 30, maybe 40, somewhere in that neighborhood. And there's another thing politically that the Mormons do that the government's not happy about. The Mormons vote in what is called a bloc, B-L-O-C. Does anyone know what that means?
They all vote the same way.
Exactly. They all vote together. These are the issues that hold up them getting statehood until after the American Civil War. After the Civil War, they have to abolish polygamy. They have to abolish these, like, a variety of different things. Now, today's Mormon church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, rejects polygamy, but there is like a more radical fundamentalist sect that still tries to embrace it, but that's a story for a different day. The first Mormon War occurred in 1838. There'll be another Mormon War that will happen out west, closer to the Civil War. We'll talk more about the Mormons later in the lesson. Really important guy that you all need to know, Charles Grandison Finney. He is the greatest revival preacher of the era. He actually sort of gets the evangelical revivals going during this period of time. He's a Presbyterian. Ironically, the leader of the Oneida community, Noyes, the reason he became a preacher was because of Finney. He led his revivals in Rochester, New York. He later became a leading voice of the abolitionist movement. He also became a professor at Oberlin College in Ohio. Has anyone ever heard of that school before, Oberlin? It's the first college in America to integrate male African-American and white students in the 1800s. That was a revolutionary moment in education. Finney is known as the father of the Second Great Awakening. We're not done with him. We'll talk more about him as we move into the abolitionist period. So, this is what a revival looked like in the Second Great Awakening. They got stage, they've got seating, they've got tents. I mean, it's like a festival. All right, American women in revolt. I am not covering all of the women in the first suffrage movement, but I'm going to try to get to a lot of very significant and important women involved in the movement. So here are some of your leading suffragettes that are fighting for women's rights. Lucretia Mott, born Quaker. Susan B. Anthony, born Quaker. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, born Quaker. Sojourner Truth, born into slavery as under the name Isabella, freed by Quakers, and goes on to become not only an abolitionist, but a suffragette. We're going to learn a little bit more about her famous speech, Ain't I a Woman? So we'll talk more about that as we move forward. Harriet Tubman, not a Quaker, but a leading abolitionist, conductor on the Underground Railroad, born into slavery in Dorchester County, Maryland, goes on to serve as a spy for the Union Army during the Civil War, serves as a nurse, fights for suffrage, fights for equality after the war. She did a lot of really amazing things. We'll talk more about her. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, first female to graduate from medical school in America. She also became the organizer of female American nurses for the Union Army out of New York. Margaret Fuller, transcendentalist and suffragette. Angelina and Sarah Grimke, two sisters who were from South Carolina. Their father had to go to Philadelphia for medical appointments. They would assist him. They became inspired by the abolitionists, and they end up leaving the South to become part of the abolitionist and suffragist movement. Amelia Bloomer, semi-short skirt and underwear inventor. That's why we often refer to undergarments as bloomers. I don't know if you realize that or have ever heard that before. Anybody ever heard that term used for underwear? Catherine Beecher is kind of an interesting one. Catherine Beecher, who is the sister of a very famous woman. Has anyone ever heard of Harriet Beecher Stowe before? Author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. I'm going to teach you about her later. Catherine Beecher was a crusader for women to gain opportunity in education, notably in primary school as early as kindergarten. But I do want to point out that Beecher was not crusading for suffrage. So it's not like everybody was on the same page. We'll see that happen in the abolitionist movement as well. And then we have Carrie Nation, who was the leader of the temperance movement. She would roll around with like a hatchet and go and like bust up saloons. Again, a lot of the women that were involved in the suffrage movement are going to be interwoven into the abolitionist movement, and a number of abolitionists will get interwoven into the suffrage movement. But I do want you all to realize that there were a whole lot more suffragettes that got onto the side of abolitionism as opposed to those who were pushing for the abolitionist movement to go to the suffrage side. Does that make sense to everybody? Meaning that there were a lot of people that were like, we need to bring an end to slavery. What about women's rights? So I want you to understand that not everybody saw eye to eye on this. Without a doubt, one of the most important meetings for the suffrage movement is the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention held in July of 1848. It was held in Seneca Falls, New York. The meeting was a landmark organized effort for women's suffrage. Co-founded by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, about 300 men and women, predominantly women, attended the convention. What they produced, the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. It was written and presented at the conference in the spirit of the Declaration by saying that all men and women are created equal. Women demanded the voting ballots, launched the modern women's rights movement. However, the Civil War is going to put women's suffrage on the back burner. Because as we're heading into the war, abolition eclipses suffrage, and it doesn't start to really pick up again until the war is over. And then women are like, hey, the war's over. Give us the right to vote. Like, what woman will famously be arrested for voting after the Civil War? Susan B. Anthony. Very good. She votes for Ulysses S. Grant and gets thrown in jail. That actually goes to trial. Another reason that the suffrage movement picks up speed after the war, and remember, sorry, my apologies. The other reason that the suffrage movement picks up speed, and again, the 19th Amendment isn't going to be passed until 1920. My question to you guys, why would westward expansion, people moving west after the Civil War, pick up the pace for suffrage? Any ideas? Lots thousands and thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, and into the millions will move west to settle. Right? How does that help women's suffrage? What has to be formed in the West as more people arrive west? New what? New towns? And with new towns, you eventually have new what? Cities? And new kids and more people. Eventually, when you get more and more towns and more cities and more people, what do you have to apply for out there? Okay, you get more jobs. We're going to get there, guys. Look west of the Mississippi River. What are all those things out there? Okay? When we look out there, we just like, it's just land? States. Very good. There are lots of states. What do those states have to do? Apply for statehood. And then when they're ratified as states, they enter the what? The country. And they become United States. Guys, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. These are states that provide women the right to vote before the 19th Amendment. That's huge. Has anyone ever heard of Jeannette Rankin before? Anyone out there ever heard of her? Well, by the time this class is over, you're never going to forget her. She is the first woman to be elected Congress from the state of Montana. She was elected before that amendment was ever passed. That is amazing. All right? So, we'll talk more about women's rights. Women's rights are never going to leave us. It will be, bless you, civil rights are never going to leave us. There's going to be a common theme for the rest of the course. All right. Top left, Lucretia Mott. Bottom left, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Bottom center, Susan B. Anthony. Check out Carrie Nation over there with her hatchet. Rolling around, busting up saloons. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the American literary movement. In the era of the early 1800s, leading up to the American Civil War, this is a literary boom time in America. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote popular poems such as Evangeline, The Song of Hiawatha, Paul Revere's Ride. This is capturing American history in the verse of poetry. James Russell Lowell, he wrote political satire, famous for the Bigelow Papers, also famous for inspiring Mark Twain. The age of transcendentalism. It stressed individualism, self-reliance, nonconformity, connection to nature. This is going to be led by people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Emerson wrote two pretty famous books, Self-Reliance and Nature. Both reflected the American spirit. Why might, if I were to hand you a copy of Self-Reliance today and have you read it, versus if I handed you a copy of Self-Reliance and had you read it in 3 years, why might it be more meaningful in 3 years? Any ideas? Why Self-Reliance might be more meaningful to you in 3 years from now? Where are you going to be in 3 years? Yeah, I don't know. But you're going to be on your own. It'll have deeper meaning, okay? Because you're going to be on your own. You're going to be carving out your own life. Bless you out there. Thoreau condemned the war against Mexico, condemned slavery. He wrote On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. When we think about nonviolent protest, who typically comes to mind in America? Dr. King, right? Or maybe Gandhi in India, right? This is the birth of nonviolent protest. Thoreau. He inspires Dr. King. He inspires Gandhi and others. But it's not just the transcendentalists, right? He also wrote Walden or Life in the Woods. There are others that are going to be inspirational in this era. Louisa May Alcott. She was part of the Transcendentalist movement. Has anyone ever heard of the book Little Women before? Tremendously important piece of American literature. Emily Dickinson, poet, wrote on the theme of nature. Walt Whitman, poet, author of Leaves of Grass, poet laureate of democracy. Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter, The House of the Seven Gables. Edgar Allan Poe, author of The Raven, The Telltale Heart, Fall of the House of Usher, with roots here in Richmond. So Herman Melville, we're going to talk about him as we move forward. Have you guys heard of him before? No? Author of Moby Dick? Nobody? Okay. We'll talk more about that as we move forward. Okay. So on the left, we have Emerson. Center, we have Thoreau. And on the right, we have Poe. Three of the literary giants of the era. Okay. Tension between North and South. The nation struggled to resolve its regional issues between North and South. Slavery, economics, cultural issues, westward expansion, states' rights. All these things divided North and South. While there are a number of differences between North and South, the issues that most increasingly divided the country were all tied to slavery. I don't care whether people like it or not. I know that people grapple with this. For almost my entire lifetime, I've heard people say to me, the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. That's just not accurate. Every clause of the American Civil War is interwoven over the issue of slavery. Because by the early 1800s and into the mid-1800s, all the northern states had abolished slavery. The South clung on. Slavery is the foundation of this war that we're about to learn here in the next lesson. Okay? It is the foundation. And a big part of it is tied to the Second Great Awakening. Because people start to have a moral dilemma. And that is, how can a democratic republic based off of freedom enslave and own people based on race? It was hypocritical. It didn't make any sense. All right? So what we have here is a group of slaves working in the deep South on a cotton plantation. And this tragic scene here below, these are real sketches from the era. These are not recreated. These are from the period. That is a slave auction that was taking place in Richmond, Virginia, prior to the American Civil War. So, this is the direction we're heading in toward war. Okay, so I'm just going over a couple more things and we're going to call it a day. Cultural differences. North and South found it difficult to agree on social and political issues. The North is becoming an urban society with industrial manufacturing. Cities with industrial jobs and free labor, right? That's not to say that all of the labor was treated fairly, but they're not using slave labor. They're using child labor, but they're not using slave labor. So remember this, that is Lowell Mill. Y'all remember what they manufactured in Lowell, Massachusetts? You're on the right path. Textiles. Very good. South, primarily agricultural. People lived in small villages. and on farms and plantations. Rural plantations with slaves. In the South, we have a cotton kingdom. What's that machine that connects the two? What is it? The cotton gin. Very good. And then finally, to wrap things up, economic factors. Thank you, sir. On the left, the North, a manufacturing region. They favored tariffs. That means they want taxes on imported goods to protect their owners, their factory owners, and their workers. Remember, why are we in an industrial competition with England at this period of time? What are they producing? This isn't a trick question. What types of things are they producing? Okay, they're producing textiles, furniture, coal, iron, all the same things we're producing. Does that make sense? We want to eliminate their competition. The South owed Northern banks $300 million in debt in the late 1850s at the dawn of the Civil War. The North and the South were basically tied into a mercantile system. The South depends on manufactured goods from outside its region, and the North demands agricultural goods coming from the South, notably cotton, tobacco, corn, etc. So like this cartoon shows this like rail-thin, skinny Southern merchant with taxes and tariffs on his back. And over here on the right, we have the happy, fat Northern merchant who's benefiting from all of the tariffs and taxes on the backs of the South. An easy way to remember it, we see the weather vane, and the North is pointing this way, and the South is pointing that way. In the South, they oppose tariffs. They don't want the price of manufactured goods to go up. They also need to move their perishable goods to market quickly. And goods like tobacco and especially cotton are being gobbled up by Europe. And the South has no allegiance to buying American-made goods. They're fine to buy European and trade in European goods. Remember the nullification crisis in South Carolina nearly caused the secession of South Carolina in connection to the tariff of 1828 and 1832. Planners are concerned that if tariffs rise, England won't buy their goods, notably their cotton. So this is where I pump the brakes today. Does anybody have any questions? All right. So this is where I stop.